Okay, hello, welcome to take 350,000 of this plenary presentation. I don't know how many of you made it to St. Petersburg, but I'm very sorry that I didn't, that I can't be, that I can't be with you. I'd like to begin by thanking Nikita and his colleagues for inviting me and for the work that they sort of put into what would have been my visit, at least to St. Petersburg. I'm going to try to keep this talk quite brief and quite punchy, because I imagine that many of you by now are suffering severe Zoom fatigue, and also because I am relatively inexperienced at these Zoom recordings, to say the least. So I think we all need to buckle ourselves in for what could be a bumpy ride, and is probably best kept brief for that reason. Okay, so I was asked to speak about issues of content and context in social network analysis, which is what I'm going to do. My main focus, I'm going to assume that I am talking about whole networks research, but hopefully what I have to say is of relevance also to EgoNet research, two-mode research, various other kinds of network analysis that we all engage in, and it hopefully won't be too much of a stretch for you to see how the various points that I make have a bearing on those other types of network research as well. Okay, so I'm going to begin the presentation with four key claims, which really will structure and underlie much of the rest of what I have to say. And so if the technology is with me, here they are. Okay, so the first point is that the networks we analyze are constructs derived from the observable world, but with considerable simplification, abstraction, and selection. So I think those of us who gather data are aware of that to some extent. We're aware of boundary issues, for example. We're aware of the ways in which we have to make decisions about which nodes and which ties to include in our data, and we're aware in doing that we are excluding nodes who potentially could be included. We are excluding ties which potentially could be included, all of which might have some bearing upon whatever it is that we are hoping to be able to study by means of a network analysis, but which we're going to miss out. I think similarly, modelers are aware of the constructed nature of their object. They're aware of issues of fit, for example, between the model and the data, or in the case of block models, we're aware of the process whereby an adjacency matrix becomes reduced to an identity matrix, and the various kinds of decisions and selection procedures that we make in doing that. But I think it's also true to say that the data and the adjacency matrices themselves are constructs. We reduce individuals with complicated lives and complicated biographies often to a single homogenizing category or identify. We look at all the teachers in a school, reducing those people to that role, that identity of teacher. We study all the workers in a firm or so on. And we might throw in a few attributes, attribute variables to distinguish between them. But it's still fairly clear that we are reducing complex lives to a small number of categories. Similarly, we reduce complex and individually quite diverse histories of interaction between pairs of those individuals to a simple relational label. We say that they're friends, or we say that they're colleagues, or we say that A's relationship to B is someone I can turn to for advice, or whatever it might be. And finally, or not finally, but the final point I would want to make for present purposes, we reduce what's going on within a situation to a set of nodes, relations, and attributes, and in doing so we ignore the vast majority of what is actually going on in a situation, in order to be able to study that small aspect of what is going on that we happen to be interested in. And it's important, I think, to bear in mind in this context that, notwithstanding networking as an activity, which clearly some people do self-consciously engage in many cases and in many contexts, the social networks that we take to be our primary datum, our primary object, are, for the people who we are analysing, mere byproducts of other activities, which for them are the central focus. So you take a context like a school, and you think of all of the many different things that are going on within a school at any one point in time, all the many different perspectives upon what's going on from the point of view of the teachers, the headmaster, the students, the caretakers, and so on. But we see a set of nodes, a set of relationships, and I don't know, a direction of influence in relationship to smoking behaviour or whatever, whatever it may be. So we considerably simplify a situation. We abstract just what we're interested in from that situation. And this is okay. This is what science does. This is what science necessarily has to do. And this is my second point. But I think it creates the possibility for two types of error. There is the potential for oversimplification. So we might simply discard too much of what's going on in the situation in order to be able to make any kind of intelligible, meaningful understanding of it. Or similarly, we might undersimplify the situation. We might just leave in too much detail that renders us unable to sort out the wood from the trees. And I think it's important perhaps to stress that there's no single criteria for determining oversimplification and undersimplification, and that is going to depend in large part upon the nature of our project. If we're involved in a ideographic anthropological investigation of life in a particular town or village, as the early Manchester pioneers of social network analysis, Clyde Mitchell and others were doing, then clearly we will need and we will want a great deal more detail than somebody who is, for example, doing some kind of nomothetic analysis of the impact of social networks upon smoking behaviour or musical taste or whatever it might be. And the nomothetic researcher doing that kind of work might in turn need much more detail than the methodologist who is trial running a new form of model and who simply wants to see whether the model processes data in the way that they expect that it will, and isn't really too bothered about the details of the particular case that they might be looking at. So there are these problems: oversimplification, undersimplification, but there's no single line of determination between those that would apply to all projects. So my third point then is that content and context are labels for some of the complexities that get sieved out in the process when we construct our objects of analysis. I think that we sometimes think, or we sometimes speak about content and context as something that we might add to a network. The network is the basic data, and that's what we have, and we kind of bring in content and context from outside in order to illuminate that object further. But I think that that is actually the wrong way round of thinking about this. The network, as I've said, is a construct. It's something that's created when we sieve out all of these other, in actual fact, in real life, indissociable elements, and those and content and context are part of some of what we sieve out in this particular process, and what we might therefore think about of bringing back in when we reflect upon questions of simplification. And then finally, my fourth point, qualitative analysis, I think, is when it's properly done, it is this, amongst other things, and it is this from the point of view of social network analysis, a means of capturing the complexities, the content and context, which the simplification inherent in quantification tends to sieve out. So I think that there are constraints when we quantify our data. There are constraints when we want to try to squeeze social reality into an incidence matrix or into an adjacency matrix, or into a statistical model of some sort. Those procedures in particular tend to squeeze a lot of the detail out. And qualitative analysis is a way of bringing it back to bear upon the questions and the issues that we are looking at. And my language is perhaps a little bit loaded in these terms, but that's partly because I think that the way that we think about quantitative and qualitative aspects of social network analysis is loaded. We often think of or talk of qualitative analysis as the soft aspect, but I prefer to think of it as the aspect which actually captures the complexities of the domains that we are seeking to research, and which compensates rather for the simplification, which, as I say, is inherent in the process of quantification. But to reiterate, that's a simplification which is necessary. That's a simplification which is incredibly useful and helpful. That is a simplification which often allows us to spot patterns and structures which would otherwise be invisible to us. So it's not a criticism, but it's just an observation upon this the research process. Okay, so I am going to turn now. I'm hopefully going to turn now, if I can. To a graph. Any talk in social network analysis which is worth its salt has a graph, and this is mine. So what can this graph tell us? What information can we glean from this graph? Well, there are clearly a whole range of different measures that we might apply to this graph. We can determine the most central nodes by any of a range of different measures of centrality. We can determine the density, the diameter, the clustering coefficient, and so on. It looks to me, to the eye, as if we've got a core periphery structure of some sort there, but clearly also other forms of significant and potentially interesting clustering. But what in turn does that tell us? What do those measures in and of themselves tell us? My point would be that in the absence of contextual content knowledge about, in the first instance, who the nodes and ties are in that particular graph, the measures tell us relatively little. If I can just return briefly to the graph. This could be a graph of migration patterns between nations, or trade patterns between nations. It could be commuting patterns between cities or towns. It could be friendships between people. It could be economic exchanges between organizations, and so on. It could be so many, the nodes and the ties each could be so many different kinds of things, and any kind of meaningful information, deduction, inference that we are going to make about the measures that we derive from a graph like that are all going to be dependent upon and relative to those very, very simple starting points of content and contextualization. Steve Borgatti made this point in relationship to centrality measures, arguing that which centrality measures we use and what we can infer from the centrality measures that we use are all dependent upon what's flowing through the network. It's all dependent upon the nature of the ties. And that is true, of course, not just for measures of centrality, but for many, if not all, of the kinds of measures and models, routines that we might use. And it's not only true in relationship to ties, it's also true in relationship to nodes. And I have an interesting quotation here from Stanley Milgram, talking about his 6-degree finding, that I think bears interestingly upon this. Okay, so Milgram is talking about the 6-degree finding, or as he puts it in this particular paper, the finding that on average, any 2 individuals picked at random from the United States population are linked by a path involving 5 intermediaries. And he's also talking about some of the kind of common sense formulations of that idea, the idea that we're only 5 handshakes away from the president, for example. And Milgram says, this is in large measure rather, misleading, a confusion of 2 entirely different frames of reference. If 2 persons are 5 removes apart, they are far apart indeed. Almost anyone in the United States is but a few removes from the president, but this is true only in terms of a particular mathematical point of view and does not in any practical sense integrate our lives with that of the president. We should think of the 2 points as being not 5 persons apart, but 5 circles of acquaintance apart, 5 structures apart. This helps us to set it in its proper perspective. And you will see that I have underlined there a couple of phrases that Milgram uses: frames of reference, a particular mathematical point of view, proper perspective. What Milgram is talking about here when he refers to these things, what he's doing is, I think, calling upon us to put graph theoretical measures into context, into a proper social context. He's saying that when your nodes are human beings and when your relationships are acquaintances between human beings, in actual fact, that distance of 5 might be rather further than it would be in other contexts, in a straightforward mathematical sense, or in relationship to some of the other kinds of networks that that scientists in other areas might focus upon. And I think our present COVID-19 crisis illustrates some of this for us. From the point of view of the virus, 6 degrees is a relatively short distance, as I think we're all learned to our cost over the last 3 months or so. The virus can traverse 6 degrees in a very short space of time, and pretty effectively. However, if we start to look at and reflect upon the human responses to the COVID-19 virus, we're able to see how things can start to change. We all, I guess, maintain many of the same relationships now that we had before the pandemic crisis, but we are so the networks perhaps look more or less the same, but the way in which we practice those ties, the way in which we practice our relationships has changed. So rather than being in a room with you all today to speak to you, where I might conceivably cough and give you my COVID-19, we are conducting our relationship virtually. Similarly, many of the relationships that many of us have had, have over the last 3 months or so been practiced at a distance of 2 meters or whatever else. So in a sense, the network graph is the same, but because we are human beings, we practice those relationships differently, and we've been able to practice them in a way which in many countries at least has prevented the movement of the virus from one of us to another. And what happens in the case of the virus, I think, is what happens in the case of most human relationships most of the time. If we look to some of the classic sociologists who have had a great influence for me, certainly at least, we look at Mead, we look at Zimmel, we look at Goffman. One of the key claims that each of those 3 writers makes is that human actors control the flow of information and the flow of resources as it passes through them. That's one of the key definitions, I think, of human agency for Mead, for Goffman, and for Zimmel, in much the same way that by adopting a 2-meter distance between ourselves or adopting a virtual means of communication, we control the flow of a virus through ourselves. Zimmel talks about this in relationship to secrecy. Goffman famously talks about it in relationship to our presentation of self, what we choose to disclose, what we choose to not to disclose, to keep secret about ourselves. And it's for that reason, or for that reason amongst others, that 6 degrees can actually be a huge distance to traverse. Bill Clinton, of course, famously found out that 6 degrees could be a relatively short distance for information to travel, but presumably a large amount of what happens within the president's immediate circle stays within the president's immediate circle, because the people with whom he interacts are able to exercise discretion, are able to know, are able to filter what stays in the president's circle and what moves out of that circle, as of course we all do all of the time. And to reiterate that, it's that and it's practices like that, the way in which we practice relationships, the way in which we exercise discretion, the way in which we edit our interactions as we perform them, which means that 6 degrees or 5 intermediaries, whilst in a mathematical sense it's fairly close, in a sociological sense might actually be very big. And that in part is why content and context are important. That is why it matters who our nodes are and in what ways our nodes are tied to one another. If we were looking at the spread of a disease through an animal population, to go back just very briefly to COVID-19, we would be dealing with nodes who aren't reflexively aware of the consequences of their interactions, who aren't aware that they're passing the disease on to other animals, who don't therefore change their patterns of interaction, and who therefore aren't able to stop and control. So 5 degrees might simply stay a short distance in relationship to those particular animals. Okay, I think there's also just to develop this point further a little bit. There's also an interesting contrast here with the treatment of the small world's finding in Milgram with the small world's finding in the context of network science. I think that one of the aspects of the small world finding, the 6 degree finding, that's been of interest to network scientists is the fact that we find this same structure in multiple different types of networks. Networks between humans, networks between computers, networks between power structures, networks between the neurons of the nematode worm, between birds in flight, and so on. And of course that's fascinating and it's important. It's significant that we find the same basic network structures across multiple types of very different networks. And it's one of the fascinating and important strengths of social network analysis, its formalism, the formality of the process, that it's able to represent networks of such vastly contrasting types. But it's also dangerous, and it's dangerous for exactly the reasons that Milgram suggests. It's dangerous because when we start to put content and context onto those findings, onto those structures, what those structures might mean, and what inferences and implications we might be able to draw from those measures, from those structures, is very different. So 6 degrees is sometimes a very long way, sometimes a very short way. It depends upon context, it depends upon content, and that is part of the reason why we need to analyze them. And of course that's also one of the reasons why qualitative research might be important, because qualitative research is the kind of research that allows us to understand how and why, for example, people have altered their patterns of relationships in the light of their doing of relationships in the light of something like COVID-19. The way in which we adjust our patterns of doing relationships in light of COVID-19 is related to issues of meaning. It's related to the meaning that other people have for me. A friend and someone who, because a friend, I might want to become close to in a physical sense, in an ordinary context, takes on the meaning of danger in the context of COVID-19. A friend becomes a potential source of infection, or becomes their own risk, their own vulnerability is the meaning through which I see them, and that changes my pattern of interaction with them. And it's the qualitative research that we do that allows us to unearth that meaning and allows us to look at the different ways in which the relationship is practiced, such that in accordance with that meaning, and such that danger can be averted. Okay, so push this point a little bit further. What we're saying here is that human nodes, and this might be true of organizational nodes to some extent, it might be true of other kinds of nodes that we look at, but that's a question of content and context. But human nodes do relations reflexively. And I think that sometimes the conventions of social network analysis can be perhaps a little bit misleading in this context. An edge on a graph or a number in a matrix seem to be both simple and solid. We seem to be dealing with something solid and hard here, and this is perhaps where this hard and soft distinction that I talked about earlier comes from. But of course, that solid line, that unambiguous number, they stand for an unfolding, lived and shared history between actors who are conscious and take stock of their relationship, actors who manage their own relationship in particular kinds of ways, and who do so in relationship to cultural understandings which the network analyst ought to be cognizant of, but will in fact be cognizant of to varying kinds of degrees. I think that this cultural dimension of social relationships is perhaps clearest when we engage in cross-cultural or historical research of one sort or another. If I am going to analyze the Guanxi, hope I've pronounced that correctly, relationships typical in Chinese society, then I am aware that I don't really know what that relationship entails. I don't know what two actors who have that kind of relationship with one another will typically do in relationship to one another, how that relationship will be practiced, how that relationship will be experienced, and so on. So in that particular, what is for me a cross-cultural case, I'm aware of the encultured nature of a relationship. The danger is in relationship often to our own culture, the danger of what I think Donald Rumsfeld would probably have called, if he'd have thought about it, things that we think we know, but we actually don't. So we all think that we know what friendship is. We all think that we know what romantic relationships involve, and so on. But I think as any of us who are parents of teenagers very, very quickly learn, often actually we don't, because there can be subculturally within any particular society, or historically in a society across time, quite marked variations in relationship to what those relationship ties mean, the norms, the shared understandings that nodes who have that type of relationship will themselves orient to in their dealings and and engagements with one another, engagements and variations in engagement, which of course will have huge significance in terms of what we can infer from the network that they collectively generate. And I think that we can look at this in relationship to certain classic studies in the history of social network analysis and potential problems with some of the theoretical underpinnings of social network analysis. Haider's structural balance research, I think, is an interesting example of this. I mean, Haider, of course, famously says that if I has a positive tie with J, and J has a negative tie with K, then I should have a negative relationship with K in order to maintain a sense of cognitive consistency. We shouldn't be enemies with our friends' enemies if we are to maintain structural balance in our relationships. But it seems to me that there's absolutely no compelling logic to that in formal terms at all, and it only really achieves any kind of prima facie plausibility if we assume, and if we assume more importantly that our nodes assume that a positive tie to one person precludes a positive tie to somebody with whom they have a negative tie. And it seems to me that in our highly individualized culture, it's actually not at all true. Many people won't assume that a negative relationship, that a positive relationship with I precludes a positive relationship with K, who I has a negative relationship with. We just don't often think about relationships in that kind of way. But more generally, I think that, as I say, formally, there's just no reason whatsoever, despite the various triads with pluses and minus signs that we might draw. There's no formal way whatsoever to deduce that a positive relationship here and a negative relationship here ought to equal a negative relationship here. It's all entirely dependent upon the context of the relationship and the meaning of the relationship, the way in which the relationship is culturally defined, and that puts an onus upon the social network analysts to familiarize themselves with the cultural definition of the relationships that are involved in the networks that they are studying, and that is very often going to require that they do some form of qualitative research. Another example of this, I think, is Granovetter's forbidden triad. Yeah, so the idea that really we would expect to be, again, very similar to Haider, that we would expect to be friends with our friends' friends, transitivity. And there is, of course, a logic to that. We can, a social logic, if not a mathematical logic, in the sense that we can imagine that being friends with one person increases the likelihood that we will come into contact with their friends and so on. Nevertheless, it still depends upon how relationships are defined, and I think that Elizabeth Bott's early pioneering work in social network analysis provides a good illustration of this. Bott, as many people will know, looks at the difference between the network patterns in working class and middle class families. And she finds that by and large in the working class families that she looks at, husband and wife have different friendship groups and never really bring those two friendship groups together. The man goes out with his mates to the pub, the woman goes out with her mates wherever they might engage and socialize, but the two friendship circles never actually overlap. Whereas in the case of the middle class families that she looks at, husband and wife have joint friendship groups. They have the same friends, and they come together for social events, dinner parties, or whatever it might be. And I think that this is a stark illustration, really, of the dependence of transitivity on the cultural way, on the way in which relationships are defined. Because if spouses in a family adopt an understanding, a cultural understanding of relationships, and of course it's not just a cultural understanding of relationships, it's an understanding of masculinity, it's femininity, it's an understanding of what family is, and so on. But if they have, it's entirely conceivable, and in fact has been demonstrated in Bott's work, that they can have an understanding of all of those things, which tends to preclude transitivity, tends to keep relationships apart, to keep them separate. And of course, Zimmel's famous work on the intersection of social circles suggests something similar. It suggests that the node who intersects the various social circles tends, for whatever reason, to want to keep those different social circles that they mix in apart. They don't want their friends that they go to the pub with to mix with their friends, their colleagues at work, or either of those two groups to mix with their family, or whatever it may be. So I think the point here is that it's very, very difficult to deduce things from raw structure, because there's no such thing as raw structure outside of mathematics. There's only structure which is composed of cultural understandings, that is composed of content and composed of context, and content and context will affect, will shape, will determine what the effects of a structure might be or might not be. And qualitative research is important in that particular context. Just finally on this point, and to return to a point that I made earlier, it's also, of course, important that the very crude typifications that we apply to relationships in social network analysis often disguise a great deal of heterogeneity. Look at any of your networks, look at any of your networks of friendship, and you can bet that each and every one of those edges, which you quite rightly, with good justification, treat as identical, are in fact varied in all sorts of different kinds of ways. Each one is, as I said earlier, a complex history with all kinds of facets, all kinds of aspects that deriving from that complex history that you are choosing to ignore, but which might be important. In my own work on punk music, I found that useful though the network analysis, the formal network analysis was, I also needed to be aware of particular relationships that I was going to typify as collaborative relationships, because that's what they were, but which I couldn't, which I knew had further dimensions and aspects to them that I couldn't analyze in a graph theoretical way, either because I couldn't standardize them across the network as a whole, or simply because it was impossible to capture everything that I wanted to try to capture within a simple adjacency matrix, but relationships which were incredibly important in their specificity. And so and again, qualitative research is important because it can say, yes, friendship relationships seem to have this particular kind of effect, but we also need to be aware of that particular friendship and that particular friendship, which are different in some way, which have peculiarities of interest to us that change the whole picture about what is going on within the network. Something similar, I think, can perhaps be said in relationship to attributes. So I'm going to shift to another quotation here. I'm realizing now that, having said I was going to be brief, I'm not. But this is a quote from Newcomb, another sort of very early classic quote, I guess. And Newcomb here is talking about homophily in relationships. And so he says, it's not a very useful notion because it's indiscriminate. We have neither good evidence nor good evidence for believing that neither good evidence nor good evidence for believing that persons of similar blood types, for example, or persons whose surname have the same number of letters, are especially attracted to one another. The answer to the question, similarity with respect to what, is enormously complex. Okay, so the point that Newcomb is making here, I think, is that we are similar to people and different to people in all kinds, multiple kinds of ways, many of which probably have very, very little bearing upon issues as homophily. He is saying that, therefore, homophily is an incredibly complex notion, but I think we could also say that it's an incredibly contextual issue, because it is largely dependent upon the distinction which actors make, which they draw within their own social interactions, how they typify, how they categorize the world, and then what kinds of values they attach to those particular categories that they might use. And social science, of course, provides us with a battery of standard measures that we might use in relationship to questions of homophily. We might look at gender, we might look at ethnicity, we might look at age, and so on and so forth. But of course, very often those standard measures disguise niche distinctions that might be incredibly important in any particular given social situation, whereas social scientists might draw very broad distinctions between all of the immigrants from a particular part of the world, a particular subcontinent, or whatever it might be. Within that community itself, there might be very important distinctions being drawn between particular immigrants from particular countries, or perhaps even particular regions within particular countries. And if we really want to understand what's going on in the network, and we really want to understand whether we have an instance of homophily and whether homophily is having any kind of important effects, then we need to be aware of those niche distinctions that are being drawn and what kind of value attaches to those sorts of niche distinctions, which again we're going to need to do by qualitative research. And of course, it's very often the case that actors invent categories for themselves. They draw distinctions which are entirely localized to their own particular situation. Paul Willis's famous work on working class kids in schools, for example, trades on a distinction that school kids themselves draw between what they call lads and earholes. So lads are the rogues of the school, the lads who have a bit of a laugh, who don't do a great deal of work, who mess about in lessons and so forth. The earholes are the earholes. That's my Mancunian English might not be very clear to you. That's ear holes. These are the kids who sit and listen in school. These are the kids who do what they're told. These are the kids who do their homework. And a great deal of the social organisation of the school for Willis is based upon this distinction between lads and earholes, and you would expect to find a great deal of homophily in the network along those lines between the lads and the earholes. And Willis himself clearly thinks that distinction plays a huge part in educational outcomes, in who gets a good qualification and who doesn't. But that's a distinction which is entirely vernacular. It's entirely tied to the school, and probably to that particular to that particular school. And your average sociologist, your average social network analyst, is never in a million years even going to dream up that distinction. They need to go into the school. There needs to be qualitative work that allows them to find that. Norbert Elias and Scottson's work on the established and the outsiders is another example of that. Members of the local community outside of Leicester that Elias and Scottson studied drew their own distinction between the established and the outsiders. People who belonged to the long-standing estates of the area, and those who belonged to the newer estates, and who in some cases were sort of immigrants from London. And the people that Elias and Scotson talked to attached all kinds of differences and distinctions and value to this binary divide that they drew between Elias and between established and outsiders. And again, this is the kind of extremely important categorical identity divide that a concept of homophily and the various measures and models that we use to capture and analyze homophily would be very, very useful for, but it's a distinction that we really need to, we can only really get at in the first instance by qualitative means, by finding out how it is on the ground that actors divide the world up, the different categories and groups of people that are salient for them, and that we as outsiders might have absolutely no kind of sense of whatsoever. I guess street gang affinities might be another example of this. Sociologists, social network analysts have no intuitive sense of where territorial divides are drawn, and therefore who might belong to what gang, which gangs there might be. We have certainly without any kind of qualitative contextual investigation, no idea of the different signs and signals that clothing, that tattoos, that whatever else, symbols that mark out different gangs. We're completely in the dark about any of that crucial, important stuff that may have a significant effect upon networks that we're studying. We've got no idea of it, independent of a qualitative investigation of content and of context. Okay, I've probably zoomed you to death sufficiently by now. I just want to conclude really by reiterating my 4 main points that I started with. So, why are content and context important, and what are content and context? Well, content and context are what we sieve and squeeze out of reality in order to construct our networks, in order to construct the matrices that we work from, in order to quantify the extremely messy, meaning, culture-laden reality that confronts us. We need, and it's important that we do, and I want to emphasize again, the importance of formal social network analysis, the importance of matrices, the importance of statistical models, and so on. I'm not in any way trying to criticize those approaches. I use those approaches, I value those approaches greatly, but I think we all have to be aware that when we do that, we construct an object through processes of simplification, abstraction, selection, and we actually push out and exclude far more than we ever include. I think that, and we have to do that because it's difficult to quantify. There's only so much we can represent by a figure in a matrix cell. But what we exclude, the content and context that we push out in that process, are actually integral to what it is that we are doing. To go back to my figure of an edge between two vertices, that edge, that number in the matrix, actually represents a very messy, complex reality, which we can only get closer to by qualitative means. So that's what content and context are. They're all those things that get squeezed out in order to give us a nice, neat, tidy object to analyze. And sometimes when we do that, sometimes in that process of simplification, abstraction, and selection, we oversimplify. We miss out details which are crucial and important for a proper understanding of the network, even in the terms that we have for the network, even just in the way that we want to understand the network. We very often oversimplify what it is that we are looking at. Content and context are important for that reason, because they are the complexities that we exclude. Those are the complexities that we sometimes, often I would say, need to bring back into our analyses if our analyses are really going to be revealing and important. And qualitative analysis, if we do it properly and we do it alongside quantitative forms of analysis, graph theoretical and statistical, is important for that reason, because it enables us to capture that complexity. And at that point, crossing my fingers and hoping that all of this has been recording properly, I will stop the recording. So it only remains really to be said, thank you very much for your patience, and thanks once again to Nikita and his colleagues for inviting me. Some of that felt very muddled to me as it came out, but hopefully you can make some sort of sense of it. And I do hope I get the chance to meet some of you face to face at some point in the future. So thank you, and bye-bye from Manchester.